My name is Emma Aldridge Jordan, and for about a month or so, I've been trying to figure out why the rent prices in Littleton in the Grafton County area have been rising. So I moved here in January of 2020 because I was looking for a place after college where I could become part of a community and engage artistically within that community. And my family has a family home up in Bethlehem. So I was able to make that transition from college up to here. And I was hoping to quickly move out of my parents' place and into an apartment closer to town, closer to Littleton. And I became really frustrated as I searched for apartments in the area. Everything that I was looking at was way out of my price range, working at minimum wage service jobs in Littleton and Bethlehem. Not only that, I noticed that friends in the area who were moving out of apartments or changing apartments, their rent would increase after they left about $100 a month. So I started getting frustrated and I made some noise on Facebook. I went around, I made a group, and I posted in the Littleton forum asking about why this was happening. And that connected me to some folks who were able to give me some concrete information on the subject. Some statistics and facts that kind of show these trends in pricing and housing, and also some more concrete details of the economics of the area that leads to these housing trends. The first person I talked to was Kayla from North Country Council. Kayla's been doing a housing study that has been collecting data and trends that show that the rent has been rising in this area for the last 5 years. Kayla sent me a video summarizing all this data for me.
Hey Emma, it's Kayla here over at North Country Council. And I'm making this quick video today to tell you about our housing study and about the housing landscape in general in the North Country. I hope that it's useful and that it spurs some good conversation. So North Country Council is working on a housing study. We started it back in August and we'll be working on it through the spring this year. And the purpose of that study is to really understand the housing landscape in the North Country. So that's the northern parts of Grafton County, Carroll County, the northern parts there, and then all of Coos County. This study is coming in a really interesting time in the North Country because our housing market is changing. And it's changing in some senses quickly. I mean, since COVID has started, anecdotally, we hear, and I'm sure you do too, a lot about the cost of housing going up, and about the real estate markets booming, and about a lot of competition for rentals. And so when you sort of crack open that shell a little bit and you look at the numbers behind it, it's really interesting to see that the stories we hear when we are in the grocery store or we're chatting with friends, they're not sort of unique to any one of us. Those challenges seem to really be there for not just one or two people, but for a handful of them. And the data in New Hampshire's housing sort of shows that. So I'm going to take a minute or two here to go over some interesting points, and then I'll leave you for the day. But let's just start by talking about prices, because at the end of the day, housing prices is usually what we're talking about when we're struggling to fix a housing problem. And New Hampshire as a whole is seeing increases in their housing prices. So for a renter, if you're renting in New Hampshire this year, you can expect to pay more for your rent than you did last year. If you're renting a 2-bedroom apartment, you can actually expect to spend 5% more on that rental than you did last year, because the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in New Hampshire has gone up 5% in 1 year. And 5% seems small when you think about it as a percent, But when you realize that that's a change that's happened in 1 year, it's clear to see that it's part of a trend. So when you look back over time, in the last 5 years, the increases in rent prices have averaged to be about a 22% increase in the cost of rent since 2015. So that's a major increase, and it's a major increase that certainly has not been met by an equal increase in our wage rates. In our area more specifically, we've seen that same trend happen. The rent prices in the North Country don't grow quite as quickly as rent prices in other parts of the state, but even in our counties, Grafton County, where Littleton is located, is 21% higher. So that's right in keeping with that same trend we've seen across the state in the last few years of increasing rental prices. It's also up in Coos County and in Carroll County, but just at sort of slightly lower rates. In Coos County, overall, those rentals are 12% more expensive. And in Carroll County, that number is 7% more expensive.
I was then able to connect with Calvin Bullier, who told me more about the reasons that rent is rising both in the Grafton County area and across New Hampshire.
So if we could maybe just like introduce ourselves to each other.
My name is Calvin Bullier. I work in the real estate industry, both here in New Hampshire, and then I also do some work for my mother's real estate brokerage in the Houston, Texas area. So I have experience down there, and I have experience up here in real estate in northern New Hampshire. I'm currently an independent broker, but before that, when I was a salesperson, my license was held by someone who ran a property management company in Manchester that managed about, I think they're currently at about around 500 rental units.
Mhm.
So definitely, I've had all kinds of experience all over the real estate industry. I'm also an alternate on the Littleton Planning Board.
Oh, okay. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So yes, just to generally start. Yeah. So the issue I think they were right to hone in is that there's just not enough available. There's not enough, and it's not just rentals because rentals are a subset of housing.
Mhm.
There's not enough housing available, both to rent or to purchase. Both of those, there's a shortage. So let's see. I guess so. Talking about specifically rent, why is the rent so high? It's an economic issue. It's a factor of supply and demand. And
Mhm.
what do we have going on in New Hampshire? Well, for quite a while, we've had a dwindling supply, or maybe if not dwindling, a supply of housing that's maintained itself relatively flat. And this is across the entire state, not just the North Country, but New Hampshire as a whole. Our housing supply hasn't increased very much.
Mhm.
Um,
So
what
people
are
just
what are
aren't like building houses and apartments and stuff like that.
people are not building? They're not building enough houses, and they're really, really, really not building enough apartments or condos. So
Mhm.
the higher density housing, especially, there's an extreme shortage of, and it's due to decades of policy decisions which may not, have been the best long-term goal if your goal is in fact to have affordable places for people to live. There's so many factors which have led us to this point. um but let's now dig into the land one. So one of the problems we have in New Hampshire is that everyone loves New Hampshire for being, they love the nature, they love the outdoors, they love, they like that sort of rural character that it has.
Mhm.
Well, this has created some and this that led to some policy decisions which have had some unintended consequences. So back in the late 60s, early 70s, you had a huge push throughout New Hampshire for all of these towns to adopt planning boards and zoning ordinances. And a
Mhm.
lot of these zoning ordinances, their idea was, well, we don't want everything to get all built up. We don't want to allow, let's say, a big condo developer to come in here and build all these massive condos and change the character of our town.
Right.
So let's restrict what type of construction will allow. And let's say, okay, well, we want a rural character. So a home should have, an acre 2 acres. If it's in a rural area, you need 2 acres of land. You need 200 foot of road frontage. You need 300 foot of road frontage. I mean, every town has their own rules, but broadly across the state, even in southern New Hampshire, we see this again and again and again, to
Mhm.
where these zoning ordinances effectively only allow people to build single family homes on um on acreage, and that's it. If you want to come in and say, well, I want to build a couple little cottages or blah blah blah, it's like, oh no, no, you can't do that, that's not allowed. Well, I want to come in and I want to build up and I want to have like 2-story apartments, like, oh no, no, that's not allowed.
Mhm.
So the state has artificially limited, through this policy, and all these towns adopting these rules. They're saying, oh, well, we need apartments, but not in my town.
Mhm.
Put that in Manchester, put that in Concord. Well, what
Right.
have they done in Manchester? Last time I went down there, you don't see any condos. You don't really
Mhm.
see hardly any high rise, anything at all. And the reason is because Manchester has its own zoning. And for the majority of the city, although multifamily is allowed, it maxes out at about, 4 units or so.
Mhm.
So you have all of these areas that are in urban areas of Manchester. They could say, you know what? You can build high rise condos here. It's totally fine.
Mhm.
No, not allowed. Manchester won't allow it. So where are those people? What's happening is the sprawl is getting pushed out. And those people that would have, let's say they only wanted a small apartment, but they couldn't get it in Manchester. Well, they're getting pushed further out to Goffstown. Oh, well, there's not affordable housing in Goffstown. Then they get pushed out to Ware. Oh, there's not any affordable housing in Ware anymore. Now they're getting pushed out to Henniker and Bradford. You see,
Mhm.
it all cascades.
Right.
So
Well,
that's
and
one
I'm
of the
I'm seeing that to a certain extent here in Littleton, where there's people I know who are looking for new apartments and they can't.
there's not any. When is
There's
the
not any,
when's the
so they
last time
have
they
to
built new
move to turn
apartments?
over.
The problem is fundamental. It's supply and demand, and we have an increase in demand, and normally the market would respond with creating more supply. Well, we have all these barriers in place preventing more supply. We have
Mhm.
labor problem shortage. We have material issues that's created by federal policy and other things going on. The other thing too is, with the pandemic, supply chains are disrupted. Everything's crazy. It takes longer to source, not just lumber, but windows, ordering those in advance. And then,
Right.
with everyone stuck at home, a lot of people are remodeling their properties. Well, guess what? All the handymen, tradespeople, they're remodeling houses that already exist, and they're not available to go and build something new.
Mhm.
In addition, those people, they're out there, buying the materials that are needed to build new stuff because they're renovating what's already existing. So
Mhm.
again, you have that problem, and then you also have the land usage regulations. And by the way, New Hampshire, although it is the live free or die state, ironically, has one of the most restrictive land use policies in the United States. I think we're
Wow.
tied with, I think, like Oregon, Washington State, Hawaii. Like, we're one of the most restrictive when it comes to
Is
to
that is that like you kind of said before, like in order to preserve the land?
So the idea is partially to preserve the land, but I ask you, what, and for instance, in Manchester, absolutely blanket prohibiting high-rise housing from being developed, and they have city block areas where they could do it. Why not expand? Why not expand? Elm Street out in Manchester. Why not have that kind of grow up, organically?
Mhm.
What are they preserving? Nothing. It
Right.
all has to do with, well, I don't want to live next to high density whatever. It's the NIMBYism factor.
So is it partially then almost like a kind of a class or almost gentrification issue where people don't want like these workers that there's a shortage of being like kind
Yeah,
of.
they don't want to live next to them. Or in rural areas, they'll say, well, if you build a bunch of affordable housing and a bunch of, low income people move in and they have kids, now we're going to have to pay to educate them, but their value of their property is not high enough, support the tax base for the education. And it's like, it's this ongoing issue. Um, but yeah, I think a lot of people, they think that, oh, there's going to be too much traffic, or I want apartments, but I don't want apartments near me. And
Mhm.
you see this mentality a lot.
And so what do you kind of think that like solutions for these problems are, or what should towns be doing and thinking about in terms of these issues?
Well, I don't think solutions can come from any one place. So it's not like, the solutions can just come from the government, or the solutions can just come from the town, or the solutions can just come from, developers or landlords, all or builders. All of these groups, there's things that they can each do which will taken together make the situation better. So I think, from the government's point of view, one of the things that they've been doing, so there was a few years ago an accessory dwelling unit law passed. And what
Mm-hmm.
this law said was that, any town where there's, single family residential housing, these towns cannot prohibit someone from creating an accessory dwelling unit. So think like an in-law suite or garage apartment or something like that. The towns can't come in and stop people from doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been really great, especially like on the seacoast, allowing like, hey, if you just need a studio apartment and somebody's like, hey, I got space in my garage, I'm gonna turn the attic of my garage into an apartment. Boom, now an additional housing unit. So this was huge. And I think that, more of this kind of thinking, we should really think, it's like, okay, is it really fair to have some cities and some towns in New Hampshire shoulder more of this, affordable housing burden than other communities? And I think
Mm-hmm.
the answer is no. I don't think that, for instance, in Hanover, in Grafton County, it's extremely difficult to build additional housing. That makes no sense. There's huge demand because
Right.
of all the college kids there, and because of all those college kids, all these other additional businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So we should, at the state level, rein it in and say, I think the zoning ordinances in some of these towns, they've gone too far. They're too
Mm-hmm.
restrictive, and they're only creating luxury housing in single family developments. This is not inclusive. It's
Right.
not really addressing the needs of working class people. We need to really say, no, you need to really, really look at your policies and make sure that you're not prohibiting this kind of stuff. So,
Mm-hmm.
and there's been some proposed bills that were filed in the last legislative session that would have done a little bit of this. And then they'll probably be reintroduced this session. And given now that there's a Republican control of the legislature in New Hampshire, they'll probably pass. So there's a little bit of relief on the government point of view. Another thing that could happen is this tariff on Canadian softwood lumber. Although maybe it won't be popular, than certain parts of New Hampshire, like, the people who sell timber for a living, the fact is that all over the country we need lumber, and we need lumber where we can get it. There's no reason to make it 20% more expensive, and especially if we can open up external sources of supply, we probably won't be as prone to price shocks, like, it going up to, tripling for the month of August. So that could help. Another thing we should think about is, what exactly are building codes? Are building codes flexible enough? Because in some places, New Hampshire's, this isn't as much of a problem in New Hampshire as it is in some other places. But for instance, in California, let's say you're trying to build a structure and you want to use a new construction technique. You want to build out of concrete. You want to build out of metal. You want to build out of a shipping container. But it says, oh, but it has to have, according to the building code, because the building code, they're only thinking about stick frame wood houses. Oh,
Yeah.
well, you have to have the door framed like this and has to be framed with wood and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, there might have been a cheaper way to do that, prefabricated, or maybe a new building technique or new building materials, but it's just not allowed.
Mm.
So that's another issue. The
So
other
it
issue is getting more
stifles people
creative.
from creating like even different types of like building different types of structured houses.
Yeah, absolutely. So for instance, and we've seen this a little bit with the tiny house movement. So
Right.
some parts of New Hampshire, it's like the house can't be under so many square feet. Well, why? Or, oh, well, if it counts as a residence, it's got to have this and this and this. And, oh, you can build a tiny house here, but it still has to be on an acre of land.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense. So allowing more flexibility for these alternative, types of housing,
Mm-hmm.
um, all of that, I think could help. And a lot of people I know, they like to bash Airbnb, and they say, oh, Airbnb, everybody's using the additional housing. Well, first of all, the working class housing is usually not the kind of stuff that people want to rent on Airbnb. Usually they're looking for lake houses and vacation houses and, condos, stuff like that.
Right.
So when it comes to that other stuff, actually some of the biggest proponents, or well, some of the biggest people who are opposing Airbnb are actually lobbyists from the big hotels,
Oh
because
wow.
if you go look and see who's funding the anti-Airbnb association of whatever, and
Mhm.
all this, you look and you follow the money trail. Oh, look, it's
Right.
the hotel industry. I wonder why.
Well,
Um,
do Airbnbs have a significant effect on the either like housing market or the rental market or anything like that?
I think it really depends on what the specific community is. I mean, if you are in a resort community, yeah, it will make an effect. It will have an effect. When you look at your normal, town, no, probably not. And the other thing too is that this is only an issue if you're not creating any additional housing. And if you look at the places that have really taken a really strong anti-Airbnb stance, um, it's done nothing to relieve the housing shortages. I mean,
Mm.
you look at San Francisco, New York, I mean, even look on the seacoast, Portsmouth, you can be really, really, really anti-Airbnb. And guess what? You still won't have affordable housing
Mm.
because all the other pieces haven't been accounted for,
Right.
especially increasing supply. And that's kind of circling back, to that article I sent you about, what they do in Tokyo, Japan.
Mhm.
Because even though, Tokyo, although Japan's their general population has been declining somewhat, population is still growing in Tokyo. But one of the things they've done is they have not seen this huge spike in housing prices.
Mm.
Um, actually, if you're going to look for, let's say, a 3-bedroom townhouse, 30-minute commute to central Tokyo, that's running about $275,000 right now.
Mhm.
Compare that to Boston or New York or anywhere in California. It's just not, you know, and it's like, why? Why is, especially with the increased density of Tokyo and even scarcer land, why are they able to do this? And one of the reasons they're able to do this is because their zoning compared to ours is actually pretty minimal. And it's a lot more flexible. So, and the types of, housing, I mean, everything has to be built to earthquake standards, but they do allow flexibility in other regards, in terms of style or, techniques or, things like that. So
Mm.
that's actually allowed the creation of affordable housing. So it is possible here. The only problem is we just don't have the political will to do it right now.
I see.
But people are starting to get more aware of these issues, and they're more extreme in other parts of the country. I mean, New Hampshire, this is kind of like a taste of what could come if we
Mhm.
don't act now to increase our housing supply and increase our
Right.
housing diversity, to not just say, hey, single family, McMansions, but instead, oh, you can have townhomes, you can have condos, you can have this. And one of the things that a lot of the older generation are starting to find, like retirees and baby boomers, they don't want to go out there with a snowblower at 7 a.m. and clear their driveway. They don't want to pay for the heating and upkeep of a 3-bedroom house when it's just 2 people. So
Mhm.
they're looking for something like condos or something like that, or maybe like a community of like cottages. And guess what? They can't find it.
Right. Right.
So people
Yeah.
need to really start thinking, it's like, just because they don't need a certain type of housing now doesn't mean that they might not need it in the future.
Yeah. Well, and it occurs to me like, I mean, definitely for young people, that's you're not gonna want a full house. Like I'm literally living in a house right now, and like I
Yeah,
would rather not because it's too big for me. But the other thing is like having that housing that puts you closer to communities, and like
right.
especially like people who are moving in or trying to become part of the community, like to be right in the middle of that, it's a lot easier to become a part of the community and help the growth of a place when you have
Right.
access to it.
I mean, what do people love about cities? They love the walkability. What do you love about Boston? You got all these little intimate neighborhoods and all these little shops, and there's apartments above the shops, and it's all
Right.
walkable. And this same thing in New York, same thing in San Francisco. Guess what? None of that is allowed under those cities' current zoning ordinance. I think it's estimated about 40% of the structures in Manhattan would not be allowed to be built today under the current zoning rules.
Wow.
So all of these parts of these cities, guess what? All these old parts of town, the reason they're so cool is because it's the old part of town that people could
Mm,
build before all the rules came in and suffocated it.
right. Damn, that's crazy. I also want to ask you, in terms of, I guess like starting with Littleton, the people who are in charge, or have decision making power here, do you do you know if people have this issue on their mind and like what
Yes.
maybe they're thinking about it?
Yes. So this is something that actually comes up at the planning board meetings is we are aware there's a shortage of affordable housing. So, and that's something which, we have addressed. And so there's a new master plan that's coming out, from the Littleton Planning Board. And it's one of the things it's like, hey, this is one of the challenges. We need to make sure this is something, which people can do. So that includes, maybe taking a look at implementing cluster zoning. That includes something like making sure that the walkable areas of Littleton, so like the River District, and stuff like that, that continues to grow and develop into mixed use, walkable neighborhoods, things like that.
Mhm.
So those are all things under consideration.
And are people kind of open to new ideas and solutions, or is there
I think
pushback?
so. I think so up here. And I think that's one of the things that really makes Littleton a really cool place is
Mhm.
that I feel like some of the other towns in New Hampshire, they're like, nope, nope, we don't want anything to change. It's been this way since, 1930, and we're not going to change it now.
Mhm.
Littleton, I think, has always, you can see this with the industrial park. You can see this with the way that they, revitalized Main Street, revitalized the River District. They put that new, Schilling, their, brewery, all that.
Right.
Littleton was like let's find a way to make this work. Let's find a way where people can build a business, and do things in town. And let's work with people,
Mhm.
instead of working against them. I think if you want to look at, some of the other or so, for instance, one of the things on my mind is, you look at Berlin, and Berlin has a lot of other economic issues and headwinds, in its direction, but they don't have a, town meeting system of government. They have a city council and they have a mayor, and it's been the same people forever. And it's,
Yeah.
they don't want to innovate or be flexible or change anything,
Right.
and they're wondering why they're having a problem. And it's like, well, you need to break the mold a little bit. So I think there's more that we could do in Littleton. I think we've probably done more than a lot of other communities. On
Mhm.
the other end of the spectrum, you look at Hanover, very prosperous community. Um, they also have a serious issue, and they're not really looking to, as far as I know, seriously address it.
Mm.
Um, and that's the other end of the, socioeconomic coin there. But it's just, I think that people should be pro housing first. Yes, there are things to think about like traffic. Yes, there's things to think about like safety and can a fire truck get in here and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Yes, we need to think about conservation and not paving over every square inch of, our natural environment.
Mhm.
But I think that those things can be addressed and they can be mitigated, but we need to have a housing first kind of
Right.
mentality. And I think really the policy for decades has been a housing last mentality.
Mm.
Only if all these other things are happy and perfect can you then, okay, you can build one house here.
Mm.
And I think we need to kind of turn that on its head and say, look,
Yeah, I mean,
housing
I
is a
feel like the
critical
first,
need.
as like for humans, the kind of first thing,
Yeah.
the first essential is like, like you're saying, housing and food.
Yeah,
Right.
housing and food. And if we don't address this, like it's only going to get worse. And you can see,
Mm.
if you look at, the issues people are having with homelessness, it's so much easier for someone to slip into homelessness if your community is facing an affordable housing crisis.
Right.
You can't, if your community says, oh yeah, you can rent an apartment for, $700, $600, whatever, no problem. Versus you have a community where no, housing's going to start like in California, you need $2,500 a month in order to get into a decent apartment. Well, it's so much easier for someone to then lose their job, have unexpected medical expenses, what have you, and then
Right.
start living out of their car.
Right.
And once you're living that kind of lifestyle, other things can happen to you, which will keep you entrenched in that lifestyle. And
Yeah.
then you're going to start to have these tent cities and these other major problems.
After I interviewed Kayla and Calvin, a friend of mine happened to contact me about police raids that were going on down in homeless encampments down in Manchester, New Hampshire. After one of the raids had happened, I went down to Manchester to meet up with my friend, and they told me more about what this lack of affordable housing can result in the long term.
On Monday, the state decided that they did not want the homeless residents of Manchester living at 300 Chestnut Street. It's next to the courthouse, and there had been complaints of looking at having to see the tents. People didn't want to see the tents in a main area anymore. They were in the state property because they were kicked out of the city property, this park that we're sitting in right now. They were kicked out of here by the mayor. So they went to the state property, and the state police showed up this morning. They came with a biohazard team from Massachusetts and several state troopers, most state troopers I've ever seen in one location in New Hampshire before. And they started to tear down people's tents. They were slashing tarps and tents, and some people aren't even home. Like, there are people that were out working today, and they're gonna come back to see a fence and none of their belongings here. And it's November. Like, we've been out here, this is my 4th day. I've been out until like 2 o'clock in the morning, and it's been 15 degrees. We had to set up a little med heating tent so that people could warm up because it's just been so cold, and we lack blankets and wool socks and just basic supplies to live. These people really have no other place to go. The other encampments have been threatened as well, and it's a problem. The state has said that they've stepped in and they've offered services. They've even blamed some of the protesters for telling some of the residents not to take these services, and none of them have been offered. Everything that has happened has been community-based. Everybody chipping in their personal time, their personal belongings, money, calling out of work. We've all come together as a community from across the state. We have people from Massachusetts up here protesting for these people, and our state can't get anything together. There's actually, right where we've been, there's a empty building. It was the old police department. It's been sitting vacant, and they won't open it. They won't let people in. They just keep taking these people's homes, and they keep escalating situations. People peacefully packing, trying to get their things out, scared that they're going to lose all of their belongings and they don't have any money to replace them. And they disperse throughout the city, so a lot of the help that was offered by the state is no longer available because they were scared. They left. A few people were offered some sober living in the southern part of the state. However, it's not always an option, depending on criminal offenses, current drug use that can't be detoxed through at sober living because they don't offer that. And the fact that some people have jobs that are right here in the city and it's too far away for them to be able to keep working and trying to get off of the street. It's just been a lot of emotions. It's really sad seeing people lose everything when they already don't have anything.
How long have people been like camped out here?
Most of the summer, at least. Ever since they were kicked out of here in the middle of summer, this has been. Most of these people have been on the streets for a lot of years. They've just been hopping from different encampments. I'm not sure how true it is, but we did get where the one of the encampments was surrounded by fencing with a police officer around it. That was earlier this week, and I didn't get any confirmation as to whether that was true or not. But they're basically making concentration camps out of these people.
So when they fence an area, they keep them in there?
Yeah. So I guess they were allowing people to still camp there, but they put the fencing up. It doesn't make much sense here. As soon as they started putting the fencing up, they were arresting people that were left inside.
There's a housing problem that's in Manchester, that's been in Manchester for a while now.
Yeah, Manchester's had a problem for a long time. I wasn't aware of how long. I guess the mayor's been kind of kicking them out of city parks for a while, especially over the summer.
So like months or years or, you know?
It's gotten worse in the last few months. They're becoming more frequent with their visits and their threats of eviction, but it's been an ongoing problem for years. There's never been a place for anyone to go. There's never been resources offered. There's never been, there's not enough money in community members to get these people off the streets, and the state's not offering any help. So,
Do you know why it's getting worse now?
I think it's the pandemic. I know I've spoken with a few people, and they've said that they lost their jobs due to the pandemic. Then they lost their apartment. Some people were evicted from apartments because of the pandemic.
So
right
the
before
amount
it
of
started.
unhoused people are being is increasing.
Yes. It's also the fact that living in New Hampshire is going up. The rent's really, really high. And a lot of the time doesn't include heat, which is a problem in New Hampshire. We have heat on for 8-9 months out of the year, depending on the weather. So the increasing rate in rent and the decrease in jobs, and the fact that minimum wage has not changed in forever. We're still sitting at $7.25. And that, unfortunately, with some of the criminal background records that these people have, they can only obtain jobs that offer minimum wage. That's another thing that they have been speaking about, is that getting a higher paying job is very difficult because of their record, and they easily just, their employer sees that and moves on to the next candidate. So finding and securing jobs and then making sure that you can still get there has led to just less job, more homelessness, more cold people.
This housing crisis is a problem everywhere in the country, even more so than here, but it is getting worse, especially now with COVID. Everyone I interviewed is doing some really important work on this issue in Grafton County and in the rest of New Hampshire. I'm going to leave you with a word from them about what they're doing and how you can get involved if you'd like to.
Hey, Emma, it's Kayla here over at North Country Council. North Country Council is working on a housing study. We started it back in August, and we'll be working on it through the spring this year. And the purpose of that study is to really understand the housing landscape in the North Country. We're trying to understand housing from a few different angles. We're trying to understand it from a regulatory point of view, so what's allowed to be built where by different towns. We are looking at it from a data point of view to understand housing by the numbers. What are the average prices? Who's struggling to find housing where? How often to homes sell? What prices do they sell for when they do sell? Where are people building new housing? Where is the housing market standing still? And then the third sort of way we're looking at it is to look at it through the human experience, which is probably the most important. Really understanding housing in the North Country means talking to people about what housing has meant to them and what their challenges have been. Data points about housing are really important, but they don't always jump off the page and grab people's attention the way that our human experiences can. So we're really trying to lean in to know not just what is the supply and demand of housing look like, but what does that look like for our communities and for the people who want to be parts of them. So that's a little bit about our study. Right now, we're about halfway through it. So we have 3 surveys that are open right now. And if you are a resident of the North Country area in general, so the northern parts of Grafton County, the northern parts of Carroll County, and Coos County, we want to hear from you. We want to know about what your housing searches have been like. If your housing is stable, we want to understand how affordable it is to you and what maintaining that housing looks like. And if you're looking for housing, we want to know how that search is going and what it's really looking like for you. So if your interest is piqued by this, take 5 minutes. It only takes 5 to do our housing survey and tell us a little bit about your experiences too. Emma, I'll be sure to send you that link. So that's a little bit about our housing study. the goal at the end of any study is to not have it just be a story or a document that sits on a shelf. We want it to be something that spurs positive change in communities so that we can start to tackle the places where housing affordability is a challenge and the places where housing needs to look a little different to work for people.
If there are ways that people who just like kind of like live in Littleton or whatever could get involved, how would you say that people?
Well, the planning board meetings are open to the public. So definitely, sometimes, especially if there's something, maybe there's a cranky neighbor, they don't want something to get built next to them. Well, when you go to build something, you have to notify all the abutters, which are people next to the property. And usually if people like it, they will just stay home. So you only hear the negative if there is a negative. Now, so far that I've been on the planning board, it's mostly been pretty amicable. It's still a small community where most people know their neighbors, so it's really not as much of an issue here.
Yeah.
But one of the things is, like, if you see something that you really believe in, like, oh, hey, we should do this for the river district, or, oh, hey, they're, revising the, community master plan, or, oh, they're taking suggestions right now for amending the zoning ordinance, is to actually show up for the meeting. I know it's a pain, it's after work or whatever, and you got to go to a stuffy, building or whatever, but show up for the meeting and say, hey, I just want to say, I've been thinking about this.
Before we sign off, are the meetings on Zoom? Are they in person, and what time?
So they are in person with social distancing right now.
Okay.
And they are on the town's website.